Welcome to the second in our series um, of speaker events at Elena's Light. Our first event was with the political artist and illustrator Idel Rodriguez, and I'm thrilled to welcome Asma Rahimyar to the second in our series. My name is Emily Gordon. I'm a very proud volunteer with Elena's Light, and also a longtime journalist and editor. So I'm going to read Asma's bio for you, but I think it'll be good just as an exercise before we really come to meet and to know her, to just think as I'm speaking about what all of these elements of her sort of official biography might mean to you, and what might, all the stories that might lie behind them, which may inspire some questions on your part. As the daughter of Afghan immigrants, Asma is attuned to the corrosive effects of impunity. Her aspirations, therefore, revolve around the imperative of prioritizing human rights within transitional justice initiatives. Asma is currently pursuing a double baccalaureate in political science and philosophy, as well as a minor in English literature at Southern Connecticut State University. She is president of Southern's Muslim Student Association, the Omicron Delta Kappa Leadership Honor Society, and Pi Sigma Alpha. She's also a representative at large for the Student Government Association, a member of the Multicultural Leadership Council and the Interfaith Council, a writing, philosophy, and first-year research tutor at the Academic Success Center, and an associate editor for Society, Justice, and the Law, the Pre-Law Society Student Journal. She has advocated for increased bilingual literacy support, facilitated interfaith dialogue, and organized Southern's first Refugee Thanksgiving in conjunction with Elena's Light. Asma intends to pursue a joint JD PhD with the goal of practicing international human rights law and fortifying the rule of law in Afghanistan. She is the first Rhodes Scholar, as well as the first Truman Scholar in both Southern and the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities system history. Now, before we go on to meet and hear from the person with that outstanding resume, I just wanted to say a little bit about Elena's Light. Faresha Ganjavi, who is here on the call, and you can see, founded the organization, naming it after her daughter, Elena, who's turning 4 next month. And our mission is to help build brighter futures for refugee women and children, envisioning a community that respects and celebrates diversity and provides equity of opportunity to all members. To really learn the depth and breadth of what services we offer, and more than services, kind of community connections, friendships, opportunities. Our website is a great place to read about it in detail, but in brief, we provide ESL programs that are 100% free and are flexibly scheduled. In non-COVID times, they're in the client's house, and during, now it's over Zoom, of course. But that's been a wonderful way for both tutors and students to learn about each other's, cultures, languages, lives. Elena's Light Health is a health education program taught by licensed health professionals at the Yale New Haven Health System to try to transcend the barriers to healthcare for refugee and immigrant populations. There are interpreters to help patients understand what their doctors are saying, and there's a children's health program. In general, it's a wonderful sort of bridge to the United States healthcare system and to better individual and family health. And at the moment, we have fellows among our family communities who have been sewing fabric masks that are available to buy, and all of the proceeds support our programming. Yeah, that is the absolute sort of tip of the iceberg of what the organization does. So, but I wanted to make sure that you knew about it before we started talking to Asma, who herself has donated time to us and who connect with our mission for reasons that you will soon understand. So Asma, if you has a presentation and she's going to talk a little bit about herself as she goes through that, and then we'll have a question and answer. Please feel free to start throwing questions into the chat anytime you want, and we'll make sure to collect them and answer as many as possible after the talk.
Alrighty, thank you so much for the very gracious introduction, Emily, and for giving me the opportunity to speak, to share my story. To start, I think the juxtaposition of my story, the experiences that I've had thus far, and what undergirds them with Elena's Light and the mission statement that it has, more specifically, empowering refugee and immigrant women through providing them with the opportunity and the resources that they need to find their voices within the cadence of English syntax and English grammar resonates very strongly, because my story, as all of our stories, began before I was born with the experiences of my parents and the way that that has shaped me and the way that I move through the world. So I think when you consider how to present your life story, especially through a medium such as a PowerPoint presentation and a subsequent discussion, you become very conscious about how you want to scaffold it. So what is it about your life story and how can you structure it to present it in a way that resonates, but also conveys what it is that has kept you going? And for me, as I did that, as I thought about what I've experienced, but also the way that that has felt inside, I was able to discern certain patterns. And so I thought I would preface delving into the nitty gritty of what my experience has entailed with the forces that undergird my identity and that have kept me going. So I'll start my story with this story, which I think is apt for multiple reasons. But when I was little, my brothers and I, my two older brothers, I have a younger brother as well, but well before he was born, my parents would take us to Arabic lessons. And so every Monday and Wednesday, my mom would drive us, drop us off, and then pick us up and stop by the park on our way home. So I remember walking by the pond and finding a goose egg, and it was an abandoned goose egg. And I wanted to do everything that I could to nurture that goose egg so that it would hatch. And at first, my mom was amused by my fervent desire to nurture this egg that she at the time knew was already dead inside. So I spent weeks researching the best way to take care of a goose egg, replacing paper towels, ensuring that the flashlight was on the proper amount to keep it warm. And when it inevitably did not hatch, I was crushed because I thought that I hadn't done enough in order to ensure that that egg would hatch. And it was then that my mom had told me that no, it wasn't due to me, but it was due to what had already been the case to begin with. So I know that that's not the most overtly optimistic anecdote, but there are other anecdotes in my life that parallel that. So for instance, I have a penchant for standing in front of stained glass windows and trying to hold the light that streams in through them by holding my palms as closely together as possible in the same way that I do when I pray, as if colored light is something that we could hold and subsequently glean and carry with us well into the future. Or I even to this day, I'm forbidden from watering our houseplants because I don't know when to stop pouring. So I say all of this to say that I've always been a foolish, in the words of Stacey Abram, a foolish dreamer. I dream dreams that are perhaps larger than are logical to dream, or I hold on maybe tighter and for longer than perhaps is logical to do, or I believe in causes and I try to reverse the seemingly irreversible because I cannot look away. And I think that the compilation to look and to see life in its most visceral form and to want to protect it is something that bestows me with the stubbornness that is able to sustain even my most ardent doubts. And so before I delve into my own experience, for those in our audience who are refugees and immigrants, I know that sharing your story and sharing the personal aspects of it and the ways that that renders headlines in detail, it can feel a bit like trying to make a goose egg hatch, even if you know it can't. When our leaders spew wanton words that result in violence and that result in dehumanization. And I want to speak to you. I want to speak to the entirety of our audience, but especially to you as a testament to what you bestow upon your children by way of sharing your stories, the community around you. And so this work of art on this slide is by Shamsia Hassani. So she's Afghanistan's first graffiti artist. And her art has always resonated very profoundly with me. But this work of art in particular, I thought exhibited what it is to have to walk through the world with your heart in its entirety, knowing full well that it will break, but not being afraid of it breaking, but perhaps moving forwards because you know it will break, and maybe you can allow for pieces of it to crumble along the way, and illuminate your way forwards and enable growth beyond what you could have imagined, growth that transcends just you, but extends to the rest of your community. And so this work of art exemplifies my own stubborn optimism. And Shamsia's art is across the streets of Kabul, oftentimes featured on walls riddled with bullet holes, walls that have collapsed as a result of missile strikes and such. And they feature women finding their voices in a variety of different ways. And so I structured my story around her works of art and what they represent. So to start, my family doesn't have many photos of Afghanistan, and it's not because those photos don't exist. They did, but as refugees know, and as those who work with refugees know, and as we can surmise, when your escape from the only home that you've ever known is sudden, and when it's driven by a desire to survive, and to survive first and foremost, as opposed to a desire to live it to the fullest extent possible, you only have time to carry what you can carry, and you can only think about carrying what you can carry. So my family members, that was as many layers of clothing as they could wear, and whatever they needed to survive. Photo albums was not one of those. So many of the photos of my family members are lost, but nonetheless, I've been able to meet most of my extended family through photos and through story. And so this postcard in this photo, as you can tell, it's very well worn. And the reason for that is because I've carried it with me everywhere for a long time, ever since I began high school up until now. I've taken it with me every time I've given a speech. I often look at it before I take exams. I brought it with me to the United Nations, and I've brought it with me to interviews and such that I've had since. And what it is, it's a rather ordinary snapshot of a street in Kabul. The street still looks sort of like this today. And it's a street that my parents frequented often, particularly my father. And I think what it exemplifies is the ordinary. Oftentimes when we look at headlines about war and about the refugee experience, it becomes very large and very nebulous and abstract. And by way of that, we lose the individual human toll of it and what that entails. And so carrying this snapshot with me is a reminder of how the ordinary was put in tumult for my parents, for my family, for Afghanistan as a whole, but that the ordinary still abides and we need to look for it underneath the headlines. And this street actually is a couple blocks away from the very same place that my dad heard the first bullets being shot for the coup d'etat of Daoud Khan and the subsequent shift in Afghanistan's history forever. And so I'll delve into what that coup meant for the Afghan people. But that juxtaposition of an ordinary snapshot several blocks away, the momentous bullets being shot, my dad being witness to that, and then his entire life, the life of the entire populace changing as a result, is, I think, quite representative of what this experience means to me and how I hope to foreground it within my work. So prior to the war in Afghanistan, as I mentioned, individuals lived ordinary lives. And I think that oftentimes when we discuss Afghanistan or countries that have been through war, even if it's not 4 decades, and in the case of Afghanistan, war of any kind, when we think about what life was before the war, there might be the tendency to think that it was somehow more than what life is now, or we look at it with a sort of romanticized lens. Whereas I feel very strongly about foregrounding the ordinary. So the lives of people involved, huddling next to your grandmother as she told you stories of faraway places that were populated by giants and fairies and children who spun the most colorful dreams, or playing volleyball with your friends under the stars, and losing track of time, as people do, as people everywhere do. But the ordinary is a requisite foundation nation, to spin dreams of prosperity and triumph. We can't think about how we are to prosper unless we have the ordinary upon which to build a foundation. And so not only were individual Afghans living through the ordinary and subsequently thinking about what they could be, but the nation in its entirety was spinning such dreams too. And so this photo is of Dar al-Aman Palace. Dar al-Aman literally translates to the Palace of Peace. And it was built in late 1920s by Aman Allah Khan, who was king at the time. And it exemplified his desire to modernize Afghanistan. And ultimately it became a symbol of Afghan peace decades afterwards. And you'll see in the following slide what happened to not only the Palace of Peace, but to the dreams that individual Afghans had and that the nation had in its entirety. And this is what Dar al-Aman looked like up until very recently, up until last year. And so Dar al-Aman was the site of a coup d'etat, or not the coup d'etat, but the violence that surrounded or that occurred during that period. And it was burned almost in its entirety in the late 70s, early 80s. And in the factional infighting that followed, and in the other various different kinds of violence that followed, was debilitated even further. So if you were to walk through Dar al-Aman up until last year, and if you were to look at the walls, you would see them riddled not only with bullet holes, but with graffiti art by people who are documenting what they experienced during the war. So that's Dar al-Aman, but I can tell you individually, some of the stories about what this period entailed for people such as my parents, my family members, and my community members. And as I mentioned, war is the upheaval of the ordinary. And so for instance, it's missing school for months on end, which occurred to my mom, because leaving your house meant not knowing if you would return and playing the same card game 5 times in a row, as if the monotony of it were to distract from the airstrikes overhead. Or war also entails showing up to class after having not been there for weeks and observing that the row next to you, which used to be populated by students who were studying for exams last minute, checking over their notes and flashcards, or laughing amongst themselves, telling jokes as people do, and all of the other ways by which people are so vibrantly alive, commemorated only by empty desks. And oftentimes you would never know what happened to that person unless there was somebody in one of the prisons who saw your friend, your professor, your family member, and came back to you to say, I saw so-and-so there, and even though you won't be seeing them again, at least I can tell you what happened, or at least you can surmise what happened. Because there's nothing more agonizing, I can imagine, than the uncertainty and having to commemorate somebody who never got to have a tombstone by their empty desk or by their pension for spiking the ball too hard when playing volleyball, which is how my parents remember many of their friends or their professors. My dad still remembers one of his biology professors for his penchant for peppering his lectures with jokes that were seemingly irrelevant, but that kept them going amidst really difficult times. And those are the hardships, but I also feel that it's very important to emphasize the way by which war summons an extraordinary amount of courage in ordinary people. And it's not so much a deliberate courage as it is just trying to survive, and survival in extraordinary times requires extraordinary measures. So for my dad, what that meant was studying in deserted libraries and knowing that those libraries used to be populated by friends who used to frequent the very same places that were now isolated, but studying as if his life depended on it, because in many ways it did. And so his academic dedication puts mine to shame. He would wake up at 4, or sometimes even earlier, to study as much as he could. And he scored within the top 5% of his college entrance exams during a very difficult time for the country and also personally. And even though he lost half of his graduating class, he was able to graduate with near perfect grades because he was adamant enough and persistent enough, not even deliberately, but just adamant enough to survive, that he was able to withstand, I think, challenges that are difficult for the rest of us to even fathom. And you hear other stories of courage too. Very recently, actually, my family and I had gone to our favorite Afghan restaurant in New York. Restaurants, time is measured by whether children's feet touch the ground. So it used to be me sitting in a high chair, not able to finish my portion. Now I actually can, and thankfully my feet do touch the ground. But he's a man with sparkling eyes and one of the kindest hearts that I know. And recently, over plates of rice and mentu, he told us about his experiences in Afghanistan. And the one that stuck out with me was about his courage. And I hope he realizes how much of an impact it has on the ones that he shares the story with. But he was saying that, so in Afghanistan, especially during the Soviet occupation, all men of age were expected to fight. And so you would be taken, you would be brought essentially to the front lines, and you would be asked to shoot your own people. And so he was in a situation like that. And he was ordered to do that very thing. And he refused to do it. And he handed them back their magazines one by one. And he said, if you're going to do something to me, then do something to me. But I'm not going to have blood on my hands, let alone the blood of my own people. And this is a man who who I've always known for his kindness and for the fact that he teased me whenever I wouldn't finish my portions of rice. And yet there's just such extraordinary courage. And I think that those stories are a testament to what people are capable of in times that requires so very much, as opposed to the ordinary just being taken for granted in the way that it is during other times. So this photo comes from Afghanistan Center for Memory and Dialogue. And it's a relatively new facility, and the objective behind it is to house the belongings, whether they're the t-shirts and books and toys of children and loved ones, or it's poetry written by loved ones about those who they have lost, and other mementos to the fact that that person lived. The Afghanistan Center for Memory and Dialogue estimates that about 2 million Afghans have died since 1979. And as of right now, it commemorates several hundred loved ones. And Afghans come and just sort of sit there in front of the belongings of people who never had a proper memorial or a proper commemoration of what happened to them. And so these belongings are 8-year-old Samia's, and Samia was killed in 2015 as a result of a suicide bombing in Kabul. She was on her way to school. I study war crimes as part of my senior thesis. I consolidate accounts of human rights violations in Soviet-occupied Afghanistan. Oftentimes I spend my whole day reading about war crimes, and at night my dreams are saturated with them. And what I find is that you have an entire life commemorated within a ledger line, and that ledger line doesn't even leave a residue of ink upon your fingertips when you try to run your fingertips along it, as a testament to the fact that that person lived. But that reality is what compels me to foreground detail, because detail is where we find humanity, and detail is how we render the fullest extent of what is lost. And this next slide exhibits my own childhood, various different points in my life. But if my dad didn't have 30 extra seconds to hide a pamphlet from the resistance in his shoes, or if the missile didn't hit the house 2 houses down away from my mom's and it hit hers instead, these photos wouldn't exist. Perhaps I would still be there or wouldn't be here at all. And so it's a realization that never fails to move me with the profundity that drives everything else that I do. That so much of my life is very miraculous. And so to share more about what my childhood entailed, I have 3 nicknames among many nicknames, but 3 I think that are most telling. The first one is Little American Girl, and that one came because when I was younger, when I was 3 years old, I saw my grandpa for the first and the only time, as well as my other relatives in Europe. And there was a room full of 50 adults talking very seriously and very rapidly. So I decided I would stand on the coffee table in the middle of that room with my hands on my hips, speaking in very rapid English, and no one around me understood what I was saying. But I think there was such a a yearning inside of me to be seen, as well as a knowledge that I would be seen, because my other two nicknames, one of them is Loveworthy. Nazana Soandari, it means one who is worthy of being loved and one who is loved. And my other one is our resident radio in human form. My mom just calls me the radio, but I always talk. I always have done that for as long as I can remember, because I've known that I would be heard. But it wasn't until I was much older that I realized what precisely that means within the context of what my parents have experienced, what Afghanistan more broadly has experienced, and what it means to be able to ask as many questions as you like when there are people who your family knew, people who were close to them, who lost their lives for that very reason. So I think that awareness of being loved, of speaking to share these experiences, that characterizes my childhood. And I think it's bestowed me with strength, even in moments where my voice wasn't as confidently expressed as it was when I was younger and as it is now. But I'm the first American-born child in my family after my parents left Pakistan, which they had fled from Afghanistan to Pakistan as refugees, and then came to the United States 2 years before I was born. And their story actually starts in New Haven. My dad's story starts in New Haven. That was the first American city he had seen, and he was mesmerized by what that moment meant. And what it meant to be in New Haven. And he told me that he went to Yale's museums, and sort of that's the first memory that he has of the United States. And my story kind of emerges from that context. So I think after that period, and by period, I mean after my childhood, I think there was a certain point where I became more aware of the complexities of what it means to be little American girl, but to also be Asma. And I became very conscious of, for instance, my name, not knowing how to pronounce my name. So when people would ask me how it was pronounced, not even knowing how to respond, forgetting what language I dream in at night, because I'm at the intersection of so many. Or knowing that the cultural context and the stories that I've been raised with, and trying to express that and the way that that's impacted me to others, but feeling very distinctly removed from the context that I was surrounded by in school. So I remember there was one week where I showed up to class with henna across my palms, and people sort of looked at me askance. But then later that week, I was at an Afghan gathering, and I was asked where my Afghan blood went, because it didn't seem like I was a part of the community. And then being in this liminal space, which I think many children of refugees and immigrants can relate to in some capacity, but not really feeling enough of here or there. And so I think the realization that I ultimately came to was that there are many aspects of how my identity is perceived that I can't control. And so I used to have such a thrill whenever I would be seen. I used to want to be seen, stand up on tables to be seen. Now I realize that I'm being seen in ways that I can't control, maybe in ways that I don't want to be seen. And that was a very frightening realization. And I started to fold into myself. And the only way that I could be seen, that I could control, was academic. So I poured everything that I had into doing well in school, because I knew how to write papers, I knew how to study for exams, and I knew that if I scored well, I would be seen in such and such positive way. It was something that I could control. And so I poured all of my passion into schoolwork, primarily my writing, as opposed to speaking to the people around me. And it got to a point where I even lost the confidence to answer questions that I knew the answer to. So I would go weeks without speaking to anyone in school, and then coming home and being the radio that I was, but then going to school and being effectively invisible. The only time that invisibility would break was when people would say things that were unkind. And I remember one time in my middle school library, having somebody look me in the face and say, well, she can't even say anything back, so you can really say whatever you want to her, because what response will she be able to offer back anyways? And I remember coming home not too long after that, in tears. And I asked my parents who named me Asma, because Asma was a woman over 1,000 years ago, who was a warrior and a scholar and known for her kindness, as well as her boldness, asking them about the legal process of changing my name, because I didn't want to be seen anymore at all. And it was after that particular experience that my dad told me the story of my uncle's best friend. And he had eyes that weren't quite brown or green, so eyes like mine. And he had a tendency to ask questions all the time, ride his bike too fast, spike the volleyball too hard, live maybe too much. And Nassim disappeared, and no one knew what happened to him until someone saw him at the prison that he was taken, and said that he's no longer alive. And so he's been commemorated by his empty desk, by his habits, and by his eyes that are neither green nor brown. And so I thought to myself, well, there are people who lost their lives, so many people, because they didn't know when to stop asking questions, because they were so unabashedly alive. And here I am, when I could have so easily have been there. And I would be remiss if I didn't try to cultivate my voice and use it in whatever capacity that I can. And that moment was very pivotal, and all of the moments leading up to it, the stories that allowed for me to recognize the imperative of speaking out. And so it started with me deciding that instead of reading for the entire lunch period, I would put the book down maybe for 10 minutes towards the very end, and I would speak to the people next to me. And that was really scary at first. And I remember doing that and coming home. And then for hours when I was home, my parents would provide me with some of the most valuable wisdom that I've ever experienced, holding both of my hands in theirs, and reminding me that irrespective of how things turned out with others, what I could control was my boldness and my willingness to try. And so after I did that, I started participating in class again. And then after I did that, I started speaking at larger events, and I started sharing my writing. So this photo is from when I was 12, and I won our town's poetry for peace contest. And so I had written a poem about peace, and I had made an analogy to the way by which we can cultivate peace in the same way that we can cultivate gardens. And I remember my mom standing in the 5th row, before I had finished reading my poem, and clapping louder than anyone else, even though English isn't her language. And she hadn't understood what my poem was about until I relayed it to her. And my mom is one of the most brilliant storytellers that I know. She had aspirations of becoming a journalist before she got to leave Afghanistan in her 2nd year of university, and was never able to finish. And ultimately, when my parents came to the United States, raised my brothers and I with the belief that we would be able to live out the dreams that she couldn't. And so to see that pride expressed on her face in this moment gave me the fortitude to continue trying. Other things that felt riskier, such as speaking to larger crowds. So this is me in high school, and my confidence, I don't think anyone really reaches a point where they feel that they're wholly confident. I think we all sort of exist somewhere in between on a day-to-day basis, between entirely unconfident and super confident. But I think where I am now, I tend to veer more towards the confident end of the spectrum than I did even when this photo was taken. So the weeks leading up to this, I still would go to my teachers' classrooms as opposed to going to the cafeteria. And my history teacher in particular would make me a cup of green tea and would sit with me, and we would talk about the world. And I remember she offered me the opportunity to speak about history, the weight of history, the personal import of history. And after I gave my presentation, she said, "Esma, I don't know if you realize, but as you were speaking, you could hear a pin drop. Everyone's attention was wrapped on what you were saying." And I remember feeling a sense of joy that I didn't think I would ever experience again. And I remember really liking the feeling that I had when I would stand behind podiums to speak. And I started looking for opportunities to do so, to the point where when people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, it was only half jokingly that I said I want to be someone who shakes the world from behind a podium, says words that are able to rouse people in the way that we need to inspire action. And so this is just one of many opportunities that I was fortunate enough to have because I had a family and teachers and later friends who believed in me in a way that gave me the willingness to try. And so my path ultimately led to Southern Connecticut State University. And to say that that is one of the foremost blessings in my life is honestly one of the largest understatements that I know, because at Southern, I was able to experience not only opportunities to speak, but also I was able to experience what it is to be heard without needing to explain myself. And at first, that was rather disorienting. So we were the only, if not the only, Afghan families in Fairfield, which is where I grew up. But then at Southern, the community was incredibly diverse, and I was around other people who had experiences that paralleled mine in some capacity. And at first, I remember thinking to myself, well, who am I if I'm not the person who is constantly acting as an ambassador for communities that are larger than she is? But with time, not only was I able to continue cultivating my voice, but I was able to experience opportunities such as the ones that I've exhibited here, whether it was speaking at our refugee Thanksgiving with Elena's Light and not being able to hear the sound of my voice over the laughter of children. So I was delivering a speech on endurance and how refugees have to endure what so many of us can't fathom. But those children laughing to the extent where I couldn't hear my speech on endurance represents what we can do and what we can facilitate if we put a pause on that endurance and allow for people to just be as they are. I've been able to speak at events for immigrant rights, refugee rights. I've been able to help serve as a cultural consultant on books about this experience, fictional books directed towards children. And books that I wish that I had when I was a 12-year-old thinking about my place in the world and the way by which I moved through this country. I've been able to go to the United Nations, and that photo of that binder I sent to my best friend. It was a 5-pound binder of various different applicants to a position that I had been part of a search committee for. But I was so excited, despite the fact that my arms were numb from just carrying it the whole day, so excited that my voice mattered enough to be a part of decisions like this. And at Southern, I felt that constantly reflected in formal ways, but also less formal ways. I've had conversations with friends at Southern that extend until the very late hours of the night. So 2 a.m. And they're my friends who are the children of immigrants, refugees, or are immigrants and refugees themselves. And they talk about, for instance, how to navigate the guilt that comes with being as visible as you are, and how to make the most of that visibility. And other such topics that I never thought I would be able to vocalize. And one of my friends called me after we had found out that I won the Rhodes, and she was in tears, and she said, "I hope you know what it means to represent our community at Southern and to represent our students at the highest level." And I thought about that, and I think about the students that I tutor who stay up until 4 a.m. To translate their assignments, who raise little children of their own while balancing their studies and balancing work. One of those students, I've been working with her virtually since the start of the pandemic. She's an immigrant from Bangladesh, and she has 2 little children. I hadn't seen her at all. She usually kept her camera off, but she turned her camera on once to show me this finger painting that her daughter had made. It was just this green mess, really vibrant green mess. And she said, "I'd been worried about raising a daughter in this country, but look at how freely she paints. That puts my mind at ease in some capacity." And I'm so very thankful to have enabled other students to find their voices within the cadence of English grammar and English syntax. It's very moving to see a part of what you gave a student in their ability to use semicolons, but in turn to express their voice more clearly, and to have other people respond to it in a different way as well. But this photo, if somebody were to ask me, what are you proudest of? I would actually show this photo as opposed to the ones on my previous slide. And the reason for that is because this photo was taken by my brother during a time in which I felt the pressure of coinciding academic commitments, professional commitments, extracurricular commitments. And I remember right before this photo was taken, telling my brother, this is going to be the time that I slip up. And this is going to be the time that I'm going to let people down who count on me. And we were looking at this photo together a couple of weeks ago. And I realized that I hadn't slipped up in the way that I was terrified that I would, that I think many of us are terrified that we will. But the reason why I'm proudest of moments like this is because they force you to turn inwards, and they force you to think about what's the source of your resolve, and how can you continue going? Why do you continue going? And that allows for you to be even more deliberate about the cultivation of your voice, and the way by which you express it and the reasons that you do. So I think right now, if I had to encapsulate how I feel about where I stand in the world and what I hope to do, it would be through this this work of art by Shamsia Hassani. And the poet, most of us know him as Rumi in America, but in Afghanistan we call him Jalaluddin Balkhi. He said that the only way to reach the sky is through the heart. And Rumi was my grandfather's favorite poet. Later, he would become my favorite poet too. But I met my grandfather once, as I mentioned, as a little girl when I was 3, before we could have conversations about poetry. But I've met him many times since his passing, in the words of Rumi. And I remember he passed when I was 11. And when that happened, I spent the week following it in my room by myself, reading as much as I could, not only because that was my source of comfort, but because my grandfather was a reader too. And so the reason why I think that's fitting is because to take what breaks your heart and to make it your catalyst for action, to make it your wellspring for resolve, is very difficult. It puts you in a precarious situation. It asks a lot out of you. But it is only through doing so that we're able to reach the fullest extent of our potential, and we're able to do it in a way that's guided by compassion. And that, I think, is able to withstand all doubts that we might have. And it compels us to move forwards with the fortitude that I think is very distinctive. And this photo is of the 5 people, my family members, who have shaped me. They're the 5 people who I love the most in this world. And my childhood photos, as I noticed as I was looking through them, my mom isn't in many of them. My mom prefers to be behind the camera taking the photos as opposed to being in the photos. So I insisted that I would take this one because of what that represents. She's given so much to facilitate our being seen in this country. And I feel incredibly strongly about enabling her to be seen too, and doing all that I can to ensure that she knows just how profoundly her love has shaped me. And so I would be remiss if I didn't conclude my presentation with a photo of my family members, as well as Dar al-Aman Palace in 2020. So this is what it looked like earlier this year. They reconstructed it. There's ambivalent feelings in Afghanistan about the reconstruction of Dar al-Aman. Some people believe that it should remain as it was, as a testament to the cost of war, whereas other people think that this is the way forward, and we should exemplify that through a building that serves as a reminder of healing and our capacity to heal. And I think about that question, how can we pause versus when are we to move forwards within the context of my work, and moving forwards as well within my aspirations as a lawyer, particularly as an international human rights lawyer. The question of justice and the pace at which justice should occur, how it should occur, are questions that are very salient, and they're encapsulated by the reconstruction of a building that represented peace decades ago, and that still represents peace in some capacity now. But thank you for listening to me delineate my story by way of photos and various different musings that accompany them.
Thank you so much, Asma. That was wonderful and fitting um, evocation of the many layers of your life that are still forming. After all, you are just graduating from college. So I think it's also important to know this is these are the first few layers of a foundation of all the things you'll go on to do. And I'm excited to follow them as you go. I wanted to ask, inspired by that photo of your family that you showed just now, we hear a lot about the obvious and often tragic disadvantages of being a refugee family in the U.S. What are some of the advantages in your opinion?
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question and framing it the way that you did, because I think we often ask, and by we, I mean American society at large, immigrants, refugees, individuals who are adjacent to the immigrant and refugee experience, about how hard their lives are, and we feel that by way of knowing how difficult their experiences are, we gain some glimpse into their experience, which is not true because their experience is so nuanced and so multifaceted as people's experiences are. And so while hardships are part and parcel of that, there's also a joy as people sort of, again, as people live the experience, the simultaneity of both. But I think in my experience, I can't speak to how a refugee or immigrant would answer this question, but I can speak to how a child of them would. And so, by way of being at the intersection of different languages and different cultural contexts and experiences, I'm able to slip in and out of different worlds and see the ways by which people are so free when they're removed from a gaze that tries to attribute their experience to something larger. So when I speak Dari within my Afghan community, particularly with other Afghan women, and so when they're just being themselves in a space that's entirely their own, again, there's such a sense of uncurated joy and uncurated just freedom to be as you are, if that's joyful or if it's not joyful. And I don't think I would be privy to the power that giving people their own space to be, the power that that has, if I wasn't able to access different spaces and compare them and to see how people move through them and how they're impacted depending on what space they find themselves in.
What's your relationship to English as the first American-born child in your family, and and now as a tutor and teacher of English yourself?
Hmm. I believe the first part of your question cut off, but the part that I gathered, my relationship to England, I believe is what you mentioned.
English, yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, when people ask me what my first language was, I suspect it was English, but I'm not quite sure. I've never really been sure about that. I'm at the intersection of 6 different languages. So in one week, I would speak Dari with my mom, usually English with my dad, and I would speak English at school and English with my brothers. We would watch Hindi serials, so I picked up Hindi from that. I would have Spanish classes, then would have Arabic classes, and then sometimes we would watch the news and such in Pashto. So my mind would always be swarming with that, with different languages. But English was the language that I learned how to write in, and so English was the medium for me to channel all of my intensity, wordless intensity, into words, sort of see it take up actual physical space on a page. And I think for that reason, I have a reverence for all languages, a reverence for English because that's meant so much to me in my development, and also in turn a reverence for the way by which being able to speak English in this country opens up opportunities and opens up sort of a certain way of being seen that is very important. And I try to facilitate that within my students while also reminding them that your intelligence, of course, is not measured by whether you speak English with an accent, but if you speak 3 other languages in addition to English, chances are you're pretty bright. So.
Speaking of different kinds of achievements, You've had tremendous acclaim for, rightfully so, for these prestigious winning these prestigious scholarships. But I know it sounds like it's been a bit complicated for you to be in the headlines, to be congratulated by the governor and the mayor and Congress people, for your sort of what becomes reduced to a dual status as a child of refugees, and someone who goes to Southern, which is not a school that people generally associate with the Rhodes Scholarship, for instance. Many people on this call who aren't in Connecticut may not have heard of the college. How has that been for you? Just seeing your so far quite early life encapsulated this way and sort of codified this way.
Yeah, the word that comes to my mind most saliently is the word that you mentioned. It's complicated. And that complexity stems from the fact that I'm so aware of, as we all are, of the fact that I'm a work in progress. And there are so many aspects of my identity that I'm still trying to figure out. So I'm still not 100% sure of what kind of space I occupy in this country. So to have that determined for you by way of headlines that say, first, American-born child of Afghan immigrants or Afghan refugees, makes history. It encapsulates your identity in a ledger line that doesn't relay the nuances, the complexity, and the way that feels. And so I think it's been that part of it, I think, has been quite complicated and quite difficult to navigate. But I think it's also been very important for me to give myself the space to acknowledge that I may be uncertain about aspects of my identity. And even if the headlines have made up their minds about who I am, that doesn't mean that I need to do the same. And ultimately, it's very humbling to see your story represented just everywhere, all around you, even if it's not the complex representation that you feel it warrants. But to know that you were able to shed a light on your communities in some capacity is very moving, and that's what keeps me going despite the challenges.
What do you think? Is there a realistic, executable piece of advice that you could give, even in brief, to people who, refugees or children of refugees who may not have all the opportunities of maybe a typical Rhodes Scholar, say, who want to pursue an academic career? Is there a, how do you think about providing sort of higher educational equity, and helping be a bridge to that yourself?
I think our ability to visualize ourselves in certain positions, it's an ability that starts very early in life. And I think we need to foster that ability as soon as we can, so that when a student gets to a point where they're able to make decisions that might lead to the kind of career that they want, or might lead to the kind of opportunities that they want, they have the confidence already to be able to pursue those things. So my advice, even from an early age, would be, first and foremost, always correct people who mispronounce your name. Always, always. And know that if it takes them a couple of tries, it'll take them a couple of tries. But keep going and keep ensuring that they get it right. Because I think not doing so, and I didn't do so for a very long time, results in you being unsure not only of your space in this country, but also of who you are. And that kind of confusion, while it's not irreversible, it's certainly reversible, and you can certainly emerge from it stronger. It's not conducive to being able to see yourself in positions that just statistically are pitted against you. And so I think, as difficult as it is, being very adamant about being your whole self, even if you're still trying to figure out what that means, from a very early age, and knowing that as you do that, your path will unfurl in a way that it needs to, and that you'll be met with people who can ensure the realization of your dreams, so long as the extent of them isn't impacted by circumstance.
And I know that's facilitated by teachers, advocates, supporters, inspirations. Is there a proactive way that the people who may feel still unsure of themselves or invisible can seek out those teachers? How did that manifest itself for you?
Hmm. I think for me, the bridge was always books. So I would read about what we were learning in class. And then I remember lingering after class was over because I wasn't done thinking about what we were discussing. I wasn't ready to leave the classroom. And so after all of the students had left, I would just kind of sit there. And then some of my teachers noticed that I was doing that. And then they would ask me my thoughts on what it is that we were learning. And from that, I was able to build a bond with them that ultimately enabled me to be confident enough to aspire towards larger platforms from which I could speak or different ways of being seen. So I would say don't be afraid to linger in spaces where you think it might be beneficial to linger. And if you do, if it's a space that you feel comfortable doing so, chances are people will see you lingering. The right people will see you lingering, and they'll meet you where you are, and they'll enable you to foster the confidence inside to move forwards.
That's wonderful advice. Um, I have so many questions, but we may go just a few minutes over if people will hang on for a few minutes. But I guess this may be I'm springing this on you without any warning, so my apologies. But what's a specific or formative experience in your life or your school life so far that really stays with you? You've mentioned a couple in your biography, especially in terms of confidence and starting to stand up, literally stand up for yourself on stages and podiums. But was there a particularly interesting or dangerous or vulnerable experience that you learned from, that you're going to take with you to Oxford and you're taking with you to the next stage of your life?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint one, but the one that comes to my mind right now, amidst the various different speaking opportunities that I've had over the past several years, the one that I think moved me the most and that moved the people speaking that I was speaking to the most was when I went back to my middle school. When I was a freshman several years ago in college, I was invited to speak to my middle school teachers about the importance of awareness insofar as cultural diversity is concerned. And so how can we facilitate that within educators? And what does that mean on a personal basis? So I remember going to the same library that I used to quite literally like hide in and have people tell me, well, she can't say anything back within. And standing at the very front of that space, in front of a room full of teachers, many of whom did not know what my experience entailed, and being very honest and very vulnerable about how difficult that time period in my life was. And then afterwards, having them come up to me, many of them with tears in their eyes. So these were teachers who had never really seen me, but were now seeing me as I was and also seeing me as I was then, and telling me that they wish that they had known so that they could have done something to make it easier. And so I remember thinking, if I can do anything with my voice at this stage in my life and moving forwards, it would be to use it to tell others what they can do to make things easier for immigrants, the children of immigrants, children of refugees, people who don't quite feel that the spaces that they move within are for them. And I feel very grateful to have had that opportunity. Just on a personal note, it was my journey coming full circle in a way that I could have never imagined.
That's wonderful. We have an audience question, but I actually have. I would feel remiss if I didn't ask one more question about your personal experience. In now that you're rounding out your undergraduate life, how a lot of us find it hard to bear, especially in this year of the pandemic, and people who are attentive to the news of the world, people who have have difficult lived experiences or family stories. Your thesis was on war crimes. You've studied political science and philosophy. The philosophy probably helps, and the English literature. Those are often a balm in difficult times, I imagine. But how do you bear it? How do you stay so positive and optimistic?
Hmm. It's interesting that you asked me this question, because actually a couple of days ago, somebody asked me the very same thing. So they said, studying war crime, studying the material that you're studying, also in the midst of uncertainty individually, nationally, and globally, is difficult. There are compounding sources of uncertainty, and in turn, just compounding sources of personal difficulty. I think what I would say in response to that, and what I said in response to the person who asked me, is that I'm not always as positive as I try to be, or not always as positive as I think we often want to be. But it's those moments in which I give myself the space to break for a little while, that I learn what it is that allows for me to get back up and keep going. And then when I am back up and going, I cherish those sources of fortitude even more. So my family, of course, first and foremost, poetry and literature and the ability to be lyrical. I think when you carry various different kinds of suffering, mostly I read about it, but when you carry that, it starts to accumulate in your soul, and you need a place to kind of empty your soul. And for me, that's language, words, lyricism. That helps me make sense of things. So I'm grateful for those sources that allow for me to keep going, and I wouldn't really be able to identify them with such distinction if I didn't break when I needed to.
That's very reassuring. Um, we have a question from the audience. Sohail asks, have you had a chance to visit Afghanistan, and what did you make of it, if so?
Hmm. So I actually have not. And I wanted to visit Afghanistan. Actually, I've wanted to every time that my mom visits. So my mom visits every couple of years, not as much recently, given the precariousness of the security situation there. But I've wanted to go with her because my grandma lives there. I've also wanted to go with her to just see the land that I've heard and have accessed through story for my entire life. I think not seeing it has caused my identity to develop in a very specific way, and I do hope to see it moving forwards. And I think ultimately my path leads there. But I think not seeing it, accessing it through story, but then also knowing Afghans who have come from Afghanistan recently, all of that has made me very aware of how careful we need to be. Again, not to romanticize places that we've never been because we think, this is where I'll finally belong. Because that's not true. I know if I were suddenly dropped in Kabul, I wouldn't belong there any more than I would belong in elsewhere. And America really is a country that I've known for as long as I can remember. So I think that not going there again has allowed for me to be more conscious of how we view places, and make them sources of comfort, and how that can be a reductionist way of looking at the complexity of the realities that people there experience.
Well, there is plenty of time for all sorts of world travel, I imagine, when we are able to do so, and that your curiosity will drive you there. Um, I know right now, if we were not on Zoom, we would have a resounding round of applause for Asma and everything she's working to do and has done. I just wanted to close out with a few gentle suggestions to get involved with Elena's Light any way you can. If you signed up via an email address to see this talk tonight, you will occasionally hear about future talks and other ways to get involved. We'd love to have you follow us on social media. We have a wonderful dedicated volunteer team who are constantly recruiting new interns and incredibly energetic women who do so much for this organization, motivated by Faresha, our fearless leader. We'd love to see you on social, on all the regular social networks. Here in Connecticut, we have a stand at various farmers markets. You can read about that on the website. Volunteer with us to tutor ESL in the future. There's a training process, there's curriculum. We walk you right through it and hold your hand, and it's the relationships that are formed are really wonderful and lifelong. You will be signed up for the email list just by dint of signing up, but if you know someone else who would like to sign up, that would be great. Perhaps, obviously, I should mention it. Of course, we can always use donations. We hope someday to not have all volunteers, but to pay staff. The donations go to masks, to health programs, to ESL classes, and toys for the holiday season. We're just given door to door by our volunteers. So it's a wonderful community of families, and as Asma can attest, having actually met them in person. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an inspiring, and for me personally, just galvanizing and reassuring talk, and reminds me that the future is in good hands. So thanks everyone for joining. This video will be available as a recording, so feel free to share it with everyone you know. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.